All right, let's dive into something pretty wild. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and for a lot of people, a very provocative theory. We're going to walk through one author's argument that the story of Jesus, a cornerstone of Western civilization, might actually be a retelling of stories and hero types that were already ancient by the first century. So, right off the bat, we have to ask this one big question. Is the story of Jesus truly unique? The author we're looking at points out that in the ancient world, borrowing ideas and retelling stories wasn't seen as plagiarism. It was totally normal. The best narratives were constantly being adapted with new names and new details for a new generation. Okay, so to get our heads around this, let's start with what our source calls the Divine King Blueprint. Think of it as a kind of story template, a go-to narrative for rulers who wanted to claim they had a divine right to the throne. And this blueprint was around long, long before Jesus was born. And this is where things get really interesting. Take a look. On the left, you've got the Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut. To make her rule legit, she had her earthly father, Tuthmose-I, for her official lineage. But she also claimed her real dad was the god Amun-Re. Now look at the story of Jesus. An earthly father Joseph for lineage, but his true father is God. It's the exact same formula. One father for the earthly connection, another for the divine one. And it doesn't stop there. Here's another classic story trope. The threatened king. You've probably heard of the Greek myth of Oedipus. It's prophesied he'll be king, so the current king tries to kill him as a baby, but he miraculously survives, which just proves his destiny, right? Now, look at the story of Jesus. He's prophesied to be the king of the Jews, so the current king, Herod, orders his death, but his family miraculously escapes. The author argues this is a classic plot device used to show that a new king is the real deal. All right, let's zoom out a bit. We've talked about kings, but what about a very specific type of hero, the savior god archetype? This was a pattern that you could find all over the ancient world. The idea of a divine savior born from a virgin mother, that was not a new thing in the first century, not by a long shot. I mean, look at this list, from Maya in India to Isis in Egypt, and even in famous Greek myths like Dionysus and Perseus. The concept of a god being born without a human father was already a well-established part of the religious world. Now, this is a really key point, according to the source, and it all comes down to a single word. The original Old Testament prophecy in Hebrew used the word Alma. That word doesn't strictly mean virgin. It more accurately translates to young girl or maiden. The argument is that when this was translated into Greek, the word virgin might have been chosen specifically to make the story fit in with all those other popular savior myths. Okay, this is where it gets really specific. A researcher named Edward Carpenter actually put together this 10-point checklist. It's based on the stories of savior gods who came before Christianity, figures like Mithra and Osiris. Just look at this list. Born of a virgin, descended into hell, rose from the dead, commemorated with a special meal. The similarities are pretty stunning. And after you read through that checklist, this quote from the source just lands. When you lay out the blueprint for an ancient savior god, it sounds almost exactly like you're telling the story of Jesus. It's a really powerful part of the overall argument. But to be fair, and this is important, the source also presents the counter-arguments from Christian theologians. They point out some really key differences. For instance, Mithra wasn't a suffering god in the way Jesus was. And Osiris wasn't seen as resurrected and living in heaven, but as a dead god ruling the underworld. So these aren't perfect one-to-one matches, and those distinctions are a huge part of the debate. Okay, but here's where the theory takes a huge, unexpected turn. What if the model for the story of Jesus wasn't some ancient, far-off myth? What if the model was a real person, a contemporary figure who was already being worshipped as a god all across the Roman Empire at that very time? So when you hear phrases like the good news or a savior god who was sent to bring peace on earth, who do you think of? Well, believe it or not, these exact phrases were originally used to describe the Roman Emperor Augustus, and he was alive and ruling during the very period Jesus was said to have been born. And when you look at what he accomplished, you can totally see why. I mean, this guy ended 100 years of brutal civil war. He created the famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace. He built roads, stabilized the economy, and supported the arts. For millions of people, he literally was the savior of their world. So let's try a thought experiment. Imagine you're what the author calls a Hellenized Jew back then. You know the prophecies of the Messiah. How might you have seen Augustus? Well, under his rule, the temple was safe. He brought peace. and his policies actually led to a lot of people converting to Judaism. You could argue he was checking a lot of the Messiah boxes. Okay, I know what you're thinking. There are two huge problems with this theory, right? First, his name was Augustus, not Jesus. And second, he was born in 63 BCE, which feels way too early. So how does the source even begin to explain these massive issues? And that brings us to our final section, where the author tries to solve these last two big puzzles. They offer up some potential explanations for both the name and that tricky timeline. Let's start with the name. Now, this gets a little complicated, but stick with me. In Roman belief, Augustus was the divine incarnation of a god called Janus Quirinus. The famous poet Virgil called this deity Iseus. Now, just say that out loud a few times. Iseus. In Greek, that sounds an awful lot like Jesus, which is the name that we translate as Jesus. The author suggests that simple similarity in sound could be the connection. Okay, now for the timeline. So Roman emperors were considered to be symbolically reborn on the day they took power. For Augustus, that was in 27 BCE. Now, historians agree that the absolute latest Jesus could have been born is 4 BCE, because that's when King Herod died. All of a sudden, that huge time gap starts to look a lot smaller, which leaves us with a gap of just 23 years. And the source makes this point. Is a 23-year error really that unbelievable? Especially when you remember that the year of Jesus' birth wasn't even calculated until the 6th century, more than 500 years after it supposedly happened by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus. A 23-year mistake over 500 years seems pretty plausible. So, we've looked at the Divine King blueprint, the Savior God checklist, and this wild Augustus connection. After laying all that out on the table, we're left with one final question. What in the world are we supposed to make of all this? You see, the big takeaway from the source isn't necessarily to say Augustus was Jesus. The bigger point is about the culture of the time. The practice of taking powerful, popular stories and retelling them, reusing them with new characters, was just how things were done. It was absolutely everywhere. And that leaves us right here with this one last thing to think about. Are all of these incredible parallels between the Savior God myths, the life of a Roman emperor, and the story of Jesus just a series of massive, mind-blowing coincidences? Or are we looking at one of the most powerful and influential examples of a story being retold? The source lays out the argument, but in the end, that's a question you have to decide for yourself. Thanks for joining me on this one.